Next up, Dudley is gonna, Easter, is gonna talk about Rio Grande, Silvery, Minnow, reproductive models.
Should we do the lights too? All right, great. Thanks for everyone for persisting through to the last session. You should get a special award. So this is the long-term reproductive monitoring project that we have on the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow. And the amazing thing, so there's over 1,200 species of freshwater fish in North America. And only a few, including the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow, have these really remarkable eggs, non-adhesive and semi-buoyant. And depending on habitat and flow conditions, large numbers of these eggs can be retained upstream or be dispersed substantial distances downstream. Now, in addition to Rio Grande Silvery Minnows we heard earlier today, there's several other species that have these eggs. They're in this pelagic spawning reproductive guild. Historically widespread, however, with flow regulation, river fragmentation, habitat loss. These things have all led to or contributed to the decline, extirpation, and extinction of these taxa over time. And as Mickey Porter pointed out, pretty remarkable, the only remaining taxa now in the Rio Grande portion, or in the New Mexico portion of the Rio Grande. So what happens on a typical year? Just looking at some long-term discharge data here. Pretty striking. The time period is centered around this typical event. So the snow melt runoff. Every year the air warms up, the snow melts, the water comes down. It's kind of like clockwork. But it's variable. You know, it's somewhere between mid-April, mid-June. And the fish spawn during this time. And it can be a really good year, like you can see up here, up for 75%, or it can be down here. So it can be really highly variable in terms of what sort of conditions the fish find themselves in. So for the objectives, so we had four, the first being primarily descriptive. We're looking at the timing, duration, and magnitude of spawning, and we're looking between reaches and across years. The second, getting more into mechanism a little bit. What are the relationships between flow, temperature, and spawning within years? So looking at spawning cues. Third, looking at the influence of seasonal flows. This is one of the big tasks for this project, was to look at the magnitude and duration of flows and then see how that impacts these egg passage rates across years. And then finally, trying to get some insight into what sort of environmental factors are most important and what are driving some of these spatial and temporal patterns over time. So as far as sampling sites, to the north we had Albuquerque, the middle Sevietta, and then just upstream of Elephant Butte Reservoir, we have our long-term monitoring site here at Sampling methods are pretty standard. We use these Moore egg collectors. We sample or determine the volume of water that we sample. And it's intense sampling, 7 days a week. It happens over a course of a couple months. But what we get out of it in the end is the ability to determine this set of variables here. So we can figure out the number of eggs. We can figure out the density of those eggs since we know how much water we sampled. And then we can tie it into this passage rate. So what we do is we take the density, which is the number of eggs per cubic meter. Then we have discharge, which is cubic meters per second. Cross out the cubic meters part and you end up with the number of eggs per second. So that's the passage rate, the estimate of how many eggs we think are passing the site over time. So what that does is it basically puts it into, we can compare high flow years and low flow years. So a little bit of the math, we won't get much into this now, but this is the the metric of interest here is the estimated passage rate of eggs. We're going to talk a little bit later about these other two. This is delta and this is mu. You'll see this from some of our other talks. Delta being the occurrence probability, or how often the fish are spawning. So like if we have 5 days, are they spawning on all 5 days, or are they just spawning 1 out of 5 days? U is the log normal egg passage rate. And the reason we need to do this sort of complicated assembly of information is because there's either no eggs, so we have a lot of days with zeros, or we'll have just a few, or we'll have unbelievable numbers of eggs. So we don't have anything that looks like the normal distribution. So we use what this is, which is a mixture model to put things together. And then if we look at what's happened over time. So to the north in Albuquerque, what we see is a pattern that's not as complete as it is downstream. So we kind of, depending on the funding within the program and in terms of which reaches were of most interest, you can see this is really our long-term data set down here. But kind of piecing things together back upstream, you see basically the same trends over time at all these different sites. The big difference is Albuquerque is consistently lower than the other sites. So there's just a higher passage rate of eggs at these low downstream sampling sites. And then the other thing to point out here too, is that even in the years when we're not catching many, so this is 2019 data, we estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of still 100,000 eggs passing that site. But we're looking at orders of magnitude here. So in like 2014, we're talking about somewhere around 10 million eggs passing. Again, think of this as the downstream terminus of the range. So these eggs are passing this site, presumably heading to Elephant Butte. So now to the next question. What about this within year idea? So what we're looking at here is discharge at San Marcial in 2012. And you can see there's this response of fish spawning with these increased flows. So here's a large increase, here's a smaller increase. This is part of spring runoff. This is a rainstorm event. But they're really highly tuned in to these increases in flows regardless of how much they might be. And then secondarily, looking also at temperature, you can see less spawning as we move further into June. So now if we take all these data over since 2003 to 2019, we can run what's called a logistic regression on these and figure out this. So this was the delta part of the equation we were talking about earlier. What's the daily probability that we would catch eggs? That's really what this means. And so here, if we have no change in flow, we're still picking up background spawning. So it's at 25% or so. But if the flows change a lot, so if we're looking at 100% change in flow or 200% change in flow, we're up at the 80, 90%. And it doesn't matter, this is the crucial thing, whether the flow's going from 50 to 100 CFS, 100 CFS to 200, 1,000 to 2,000, we see this relationship. So when it's low flow years and there's a little bit of water coming down, they will spawn. And likewise, if it's a high flow year and the spring runoff arrives, they'll spawn on that as well. Temperature, not as good. But we still see a little bit of difference, you know, at the cooler temperatures, they seem to be spawning earlier in the year versus later in the year. And these correspond to those trends. Now, if we move on to the densities. So we'll switch gear a little bit here and look at fish densities. So these are Rio Grande Silvery Minnow adults in October. And the reason I wanted to show you these was first, we just got this value. So this is just a naive mean. So we haven't done all the statistics on this yet, but we don't expect it to be much different. But basically we see this really cool pattern over time. And it goes up and down with the flows. So the flows go up, we catch more fish in the fall. The flows go down and we catch fewer. And it's kind of like a clockwork sort of relationship at this point. It's really working out well over a long time span, including this year. Now, if we look at the egg passage rates, contrast, there's a little bit more noise, but we see essentially the inverse pattern. So during some of the highest flow years, like between 2008 to 10, 2017, 2019, we see lower egg passage rates. In some of the low flow years, we see some of the highest egg passage rates. So it seems almost counterintuitive. Why would we have more eggs and catch less fish? We'll get into that a little bit more later, but keep in mind, these are egg passage rates. So that's part of what we're thinking about here. And then if we look at them in terms of discharge, we can quantify these things and see, you know, how do these egg passage rates relate to discharge covariance? So the number of days that flow exceeds 2,500 CFS, or the mean daily discharge. And again, we see this pattern, somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000, there seems to be a break. And at that point, we invariably see lower egg passage rates as compared to some of these years. As I say, there's a little bit more variability in these years, but we're missing this entire section right here. And this is after almost 20 years of data. And what this tells us is that during these years, with these high flows, what we think is going on is that these eggs are being more effectively entrained or retained upstream. In the lower flow years, and this could be habitat based, these eggs are being essentially swept downstream more effectively. So to model this in an ecological sense, we break this question apart again. We're talking about these two factors, this delta mu. So this occurrence probability and this log normal passage rate. So we look at those again at these different covariates that I just showed you. We run it through, we have some random effects and fixed effects that we put on these models to allow wiggle room. And then we look at the standard methods with AIC to see how these fit into models. So again, we see the similar sort of pattern with these different components of this passage rate. But they're doing basically the same thing. So they're kind of going down, up and down together. They're sometimes breaking a little bit in certain years. And so when we look at the final model results, we'll talk about those, which are right here. So out of 160 ecological models, we only had 2 that kind of floated to the top here. And they take up about 65% of the total model weight. But they're both high flow models. So we have high frequency of spawning when there's very few or no days of high flows. And we find the inverse, we have very low passage rates when we have very high flows. So just to wrap up, we found these egg occurrence probabilities were higher during years with reduced and to truncated spring flows, but that the egg passage rates were lowest during these high spring flow events. What's probably going on is that the proportion of individuals retained and successfully recruited upstream is related to the complexity of the in-stream habitat conditions, i.e. high spring runoff. Ongoing efforts to restore dynamic river flows, connect the reaches, and reestablish a floodplain, all things that we've been talking about today, are going to be crucial for promoting these self-sustaining populations of silvery minnow. And then just the continued study, so research, monitoring, adaptive management, all these things play into part and kind of allow us over time to understand more about the system. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, you've been doing this for a long time, and I think we're at the stage where we want to start figuring out adaptive management decision-making, what to do with water that we have available, and especially in, you know, the high flow years. I think we found that, yeah, okay, well, you know, we can get back up there, we can get population numbers up. We've got our habitat. It's the low flow years, and especially when we have 1 or 2 low flow years, we're finding a lot of eggs. So the good thing is we're able to bring them into the propagation facilities. I mean, at least we have some refusal populations there, and we can do the genetics and all that. But can you think of any way we can maybe start retaining eggs at those low flow within the stream system itself. They're obviously spawning, but the eggs are going down for food for bass down in Pelican Butte. So what can we do?
Yeah, terrific question, Grace. So that's really kind of gets at the heart of the challenge that's ahead of us, I think, in so many ways. And so the trick is, can we do things at these lower flows to be able to essentially have a lower flow river system, I mean, that's functional. So when we have these lower flows, a lot of these sites, we end up with very little or no habitat, essentially no habitat. And so the question is, could you design, engineer things to be able to essentially have the river be wider at lower flows? And that's really the challenge, is that there's been some successes. I know the Bureau is working on it right now down near Bosque del Apache. And the question is, you know, how much impact will it have, and will it be enough to something that we can actually detect in the population? Because when we think about the whole middle Rio Grande, it's just so big. And so could we do something though? These could be really important actually. Just small areas could actually be really important. If the fish are keying in on these areas, spawning, and there's a lot of recruitment in those spots, it could make a difference. And it's just a matter of, you know, will it?
I was wondering, in terms of your monitoring and also just anecdotally, you know, what are some of the really interesting things or differences that you've seen between 2017 and this year, both having a lot of overbank flooding?
Yeah, so, I mean, the interesting thing is we don't catch many eggs, which tells us that there's something going on upstream with the fish population. And the thing that's really striking about these high flow years is almost what we saw in the first talk. It's really kind of hard to wrap your head around it when you're on the ground, but seeing it from the air, you can just see the spatial extent of the amount of overbank flow during these years. And so it changes. It's almost like a threshold. Like it goes up, there's this massive threshold, and then it just floods out to the edge of the levees. And so the amount of habitat that's created during those sort of flows is really, that's probably the most striking thing. And we see it not just with silvery minnow, but with other fish species as well. Some of them really respond to those because, you know, they use the same sort of conditions. Floodplains are known around the world being, you know, that's the key thing for freshwater fish. So that's what we're trying to do here. It won't just benefit silvery minnow, but it'll be beneficial for a lot of different organisms.